As someone who has spent decades observing, analyzing, and quietly living alongside the emotional currents of the young and the restless, I find myself returning again and again to a central question that this series never stops asking. How far can a human soul bend before it breaks? Or worse, transforms into something unrecognizable? The recent chain of events involving Diane Jenkins, Patty Williams, and Jack Abbott is not merely shocking television. It is, in many ways, a distilled expression of what this show has always done best, taking familiar emotional truths and pushing them into unsettling, almost mythic territory. I have followed Jack Abbott's journey for so long that I no longer see him simply as a character. He feels like an old acquaintance whose life I have watched unfold through triumphs, betrayals, and endless attempts at redemption. That is precisely why this moment, his collapse beside Patty's lifeless body, resonates with such devastating force. It is not just grief we are witnessing. It is the implosion of a man who has spent years trying to believe in moral order, in second chances, in the idea that people, even deeply flawed ones like Diane, can change. But what happens when that belief is shattered in the most brutal way imaginable? Diane's act is chilling not simply because of its violence, but because of its composure. There is no frenzy, no visible hesitation, only a cold, deliberate finality. For longtime viewers like us, especially those who have grown older with the show, this is where the writing becomes both fascinating and troubling. Diane has always existed in a morally ambiguous space, but ambiguity is one thing. Calculated execution is another. Are we meant to see this as the inevitable culmination of her past, or as a radical departure designed to shock? I find myself leaning toward the former, though not without reservations. Over the years, Diane has demonstrated a capacity for manipulation that borders on the pathological. Yet, even so, this moment feels like a crossing of a threshold, a point beyond which redemption becomes not just difficult, but philosophically questionable. And then there is that whisper. Those three dark words she breathes into Jack's ear. We are not told what they are, and that, in my view, is a masterstroke. In a genre often criticized for over-explaining, this silence is powerful. It invites us, especially those of us who have spent years reading between the lines, to participate in the narrative. What could Diane possibly say that would provoke such a visceral transformation in Jack? Was it a justification, a confession, or something far more insidious? Perhaps a suggestion that implicates Jack himself, even indirectly, in Patty's fate. Jack's reaction is what truly unsettles me. His grief is expected, his anguish entirely human. But the shift that follows, that flicker of something unhinged in his eyes, suggests that Diane's words have not merely hurt him, they have altered him. And here's where the story begins to transcend its immediate shock value and enter deeper psychological territory. We are no longer just watching a tragedy unfold. We are witnessing the potential birth of a new identity. Could it be that Diane, in that whispered moment, has succeeded in doing what years of rivalry and emotional turmoil never quite achieved, breaking Jack at his core? For viewers in their later years, I think this resonates on a particularly profound level. We understand, perhaps more than younger audiences, that life is not a series of clean moral resolutions. We have seen how a single moment, one decision, one revelation, can redefine an entire life. Jack's collapse is not just the loss of Patty, it is the loss of a version of himself. And that is something deeply unsettling, because it raises a question that lingers long after the scene ends. Who does Jack become now? From a structural standpoint, I find this storyline both daring and precarious. On one hand, it injects a raw intensity into the narrative that recalls the golden eras of the show, when emotional stakes were allowed to feel genuinely dangerous. On the other hand, it risks alienating viewers if not handled with care. Longtime audiences, particularly those who have invested decades into these characters, are not simply looking for shock. They are looking for meaning. Violence, when used, must serve a larger thematic purpose. Otherwise, it becomes hollow. So what is the purpose here? I would argue that it lies in the exploration of moral contagion. Diane's act is not isolated. It spreads. It infects Jack, destabilizing his identity. It will undoubtedly ripple outward, affecting other relationships, other narratives. In this sense, the show is reminding us that actions do not exist in a vacuum. They echo, they distort, they transform. And sometimes, The most profound consequences are not the ones we can immediately see, but the ones that unfold slowly, quietly, within the human psyche. I also find myself reflecting on Patty Williams in all of this. For a character who has often been portrayed as unstable, even tragic, her death carries a certain symbolic weight. She has long existed on the margins of Genoa City's social order, a reminder of what happens when emotional wounds are left untreated. Her end, at Diane's hands, feels almost like a collision between two different forms of brokenness, one chaotic, the other controlled. And perhaps that is part of what makes this so disturbing. Diane is not acting out of visible instability. She is acting with clarity, and that clarity is far more frightening. As I sit with this storyline, I cannot help but ask, is there any path forward that feels true to these characters? Can Jack find a way to process this trauma without losing himself entirely? Can Diane's actions be contextualized in a way that preserves even a fragment of her humanity? Or has the show deliberately chosen to push us into a space where such questions have no comforting answers? In my years of watching and reflecting on The Young and the Restless, I've come to appreciate its willingness to embrace discomfort. It does not always succeed, but when it does, it creates moments like this. Moments that linger, that provoke, that demand to be examined rather than simply consumed. This is one of those moments. It is not easy to watch, nor should it be, but it is undeniably compelling. And perhaps that is why, after all these years, I am still here, still watching, still thinking. Because beneath the melodrama, beneath the twists and turns, the show continues to ask questions that feel deeply, uncomfortably real. What does it mean to lose faith in someone you love? What happens when the line between right and wrong is not just blurred, but obliterated? And most importantly, when faced with such darkness, do we resist it? Or do we, like Jack in that haunting moment, feel something inside us begin to change? I do not yet know where this story will lead, but I do know this. It has reminded me, once again, why this show has endured. Not because it is always comforting, but because it is willing to confront the shadows that many stories avoid. And for those of us who have spent a lifetime watching, that willingness is both unsettling and, in its own way, deeply meaningful. And yet, the more I revisit that scene in my mind, the less it feels like a singular act of violence, and the more it resembles a quiet turning point in the moral architecture of The Young and the Restless itself. I have seen this series reinvent its emotional language many times over the decades, but rarely has it done so with such eerie restraint. The horror here is not loud. It is intimate, almost whispered, just like the 3 words from Diane Jenkins that seem to echo far louder than any scream. What unsettles me most, as I continue to reflect, is the possibility that those words were not meant to comfort or even justify, but to recruit. That may sound extreme, but consider the effect they have on Jack Abbott. His grief does not simply deepen, it mutates. There is a difference, and longtime viewers will recognize it instinctively. We have seen Jack suffer before, seen him rage, seen him rebuild. But this feels different. This feels like the beginning of an internal alignment shift, as though Diane has reached into the very core of his identity and nudged it, ever so slightly, off balance. Could it be that Diane is not merely seeking to escape the consequences of her actions, but to ensure that Jack cannot stand apart from them? If he begins to see the world through even a fraction of her perspective, then she is no longer alone in her moral isolation. This is what I mean when I speak of moral contagion. It is not always about turning someone into a mirror image of the perpetrator, but about eroding the clarity that once separated them. For those of us who have grown older with this show, this kind of storytelling carries a particular weight. We understand that the most dangerous transformations are rarely dramatic on the surface. They happen slowly, through rationalization, through the quiet rewriting of one's own narrative. Jack, in that fragile state, is vulnerable not just to grief, but to reinterpretation. If Diane's words offered him a way, however distorted, to make sense of what he has just witnessed, then they may take root in ways he himself does not fully recognize. And where then does that leave the memory of Patty Williams? I find myself returning to her again, because in many respects, she becomes the silent center of this unfolding storm. Patty has always been a character defined by instability, by emotional excess, by a kind of tragic unpredictability that made her both compelling and difficult to embrace. But in death, she is stripped of all that noise. What remains is a question. Was she merely a victim in this moment, or does the show intend for us to see her as something more complex, a catalyst, perhaps, for the unraveling of others? There is a risk here, and I feel it quite strongly. When a narrative removes a character in such a brutal fashion, it must be careful not to reduce them to a plot device. Patty's history, her pain, her fractured psyche, these are not trivial details. They are the threads that, if properly honored, can elevate this storyline from shock to tragedy. If ignored, however, they risk turning her death into something hollow, a mere stepping stone for the development of Diane and Jack. I also cannot help but think about how this moment will ripple outward into the broader fabric of Genoa City. This is not an isolated event, and the show has always been at its best when it allows consequences to spread organically. How will others interpret what has happened? Will they see Diane as a monster? Or will there be those who attempt to contextualize her actions, to find some twisted logic within them? And what of Jack? Will those closest to him recognize the subtle shift in his demeanor? Or will it go unnoticed until it is too late? There is, in all of this, a quiet challenge being posed to the audience, particularly to those of us who have been watching for many years. We are being asked not just to react, but to reflect. It is easy to condemn Diane outright, to draw a clear line between right and wrong. But the show complicates that instinct by focusing so intensely on Jack's reaction. It invites us to consider not just what Diane has done, but what her actions reveal about the fragility of those around her. And perhaps that is where the true power of this storyline lies. Not in the act itself, but in its aftermath. Violence, in storytelling, is often immediate and visceral, but its consequences are quieter, more insidious. They seep into relationships, into identities, into the very way characters perceive themselves and each other. If the show is willing to explore those consequences with the depth they deserve, then this could become one of the most memorable arcs in recent memory. I find myself thinking, too, about the passage of time, not just within the narrative, but in our own lives as viewers. Many of us have watched the young and the restless through different stages of our lives, bringing our own experiences, our own losses, our own moments of disillusionment to the screen. What resonates with us now is not necessarily what resonated decades ago. Scenes like this carry a different weight when one has lived long enough to understand that people are capable of both great tenderness and great darkness, sometimes within the same breath. So I ask myself, is this storyline asking us to accept that darkness as an inevitable part of the human condition, or is it challenging us to resist it? And in Jack's case, what would resistance even look like? Is it possible for him to hold on to his sense of self in the face of such a profound shock? Or has Diane's whisper already begun to reshape him in ways that cannot be undone? I do not have definitive answers, and perhaps that is precisely the point. The strength of this moment lies in its ambiguity, in its refusal to provide easy resolutions. It lingers, it unsettles, it invites us to keep thinking long after the episode ends. And for a show that has been part of our lives for so many years, that kind of lingering impact is no small achievement. As I continue to watch, I find myself less concerned with where the plot will go next and more interested in how the characters will carry what has already happened. Because in the end, it is not the twists that define a story, but the way those twists reshape the people at its center. And right now, in the quiet aftermath of that haunting scene, it feels as though something fundamental has shifted, not just for Diane or Jack, but for the very emotional core of the series itself. I find myself less concerned with where the plot will go next and more interested in how the characters will carry what has already happened. Because in the end, it is not the twists that define a story, but the way those twists reshape the people at its center. And right now, in the quiet aftermath of that haunting scene, it feels as though something fundamental has shifted, not just for Diane or Jack, but for the very emotional core of the series itself.